Up first is Dr. Gene Greisman. Dr. Greisman is internationally known. He's written 7 books, including a bestseller called Time Tactics of Very Successful People. He does a one-man play on Abraham Lincoln, and he's performed at Ford's Theater, at the Lincoln Memorial, and in front of over 20,000 people at the Georgia Dome. And Dr. Greisman, thanks for being with us on WHO Radio this President's Day weekend.
Well, I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
We have to find out, of course, how you got interested in Lincoln, and how did you get into the deal where you started to portray him?
Okay. The way I got into him, I got interested in what makes people successful in their careers. I had my own television show on CBS for a number of years called Up Close, interviewing celebrities.
Oh.
And I became interested in what makes these people really good in their careers, and started writing books about it and doing keynotes at conventions and seminars on that subject, which I still do. And eventually I thought, why don't I create a play about a highly successful American? And began to think, who would that be? And then it occurred to me, why not Lincoln? He's our most famous high achiever. He's our best success story, from log cabin to White House.
And yet there were other people out there doing that type of thing, weren't there?
There were, but they don't do it. They don't do what I do. I use Abraham Lincoln to convey a message about how to become successful in one's career.
So this is like Lincoln giving a motivational speech?
Yes, I've turned Lincoln into a motivational speaker.
Wow. Great idea.
So that's exactly right. And so Lincoln comes back, and I speak to conventions. I did one in Chicago this past Saturday. And Lincoln comes back and tells lessons he learned about how to be successful at what you do.
What are some examples of that?
Well, one example that he learned to be a great listener. And by means of listening, he continued his education all his life. In fact, he said that he learned to do this in the courtroom. He said, I anticipated my opponent's argument. He spent more time listening to Douglas. He said, I spent more time thinking about what he was going to say than what I was going to say. Became a great listener.
Interesting. So this is good for really any of us, not just the executive types, but any of us who want to learn how to make it in this world. We can take Lincoln's words, and that's why you've written a book called The Words Lincoln Lived By.
Yes, and The Words Lincoln Lived By is a special kind of Lincoln book. It's other books, and they're very fine for what they are, focus on slavery or politics or some such thing. I decided that I would write a book on Lincoln that would focus on what made him successful. And so I organized it into 52 basic themes, ranging from courage to generosity to forgiveness. These are the basic themes that run through his life. And so The Words Lincoln Lived By is that kind of book.
Tell us a little bit more about Lincoln in terms of his character qualities. And I'll just be honest with you, I've interviewed other historians who have started to say some negative things about Lincoln. They, for instance, say that he was packaged, that there was a type of spin control back then, that he really was a much darker, moodier character than we've been led to believe.
Well, they are right in what they say, that he was a much more complex individual than people think of him. He had many sides. We think of him, for example, as a very serious person. The truth is, he was a great joke teller, and some of them were earthy. He was a very skillful politician, and any politician who gets elected to high office and stays there has to understand timing. And so Lincoln was a very skillful timer of his moves.
So why is it then that some of the historians today are saying negative things about him?
Well, generally the people who are saying negative things about him do it for two basic reasons. They say, one, that he took too much power to himself and gave to the central government too much power. So he was a usurper of authority and power. So there are those kinds of critics. And then there are the critics who say that he didn't do enough for black people quickly enough. And so those kinds of critics are around. And I'll be happy if you have time to respond to both of those kinds of criticisms.
Well, go ahead. I'm interested in the aspect of, some people say, why didn't he end slavery sooner? Because he tended to take his time to do it.
Well, first of all, and it's interesting that people accuse him of being a usurper of authority, he was a constitutional ruler. He was not a dictator. And he recognized that the Constitution did not give him the authority to abolish slavery in the individual states. Only states had the right under the Constitution to abolish slavery. And so until an amendment was passed, and that was actually ratified after his death, the federal government could not abolish slavery in the states. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves, was done in his position as Commander-in-Chief of the Army.
Yeah, there are some people who actually say he created his own Constitution. He came up with things, basically.
Well, he did look for creative ways to do things because the Constitution made no provision for a civil war.
Right. Dr. Greisman, is it okay if I call you a Lincoln impersonator? Is that word okay?
That'll work. I usually call myself a portrayer, but we'll not quibble over that.
Okay. What would Lincoln think of President's Day, since we're celebrating it?
I think he would love it. I think he would be thrilled that his name was associated with two people he admired most, and that was George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
But would he be upset that he no longer gets his own day? Like when I was a kid, Lincoln had his own birthday celebrated as a holiday.
Oh, he probably wouldn't be upset about it. If he were still running for office, he would like to have the recognition.
That's one thing I learned from reading your book, The Words Lincoln Lived By, that he wanted to be esteemed. He loved recognition.
Oh, he did.
And the funny thing was, he was ridiculed so much by people.
Yes, people loved to make fun of him. And in fact, what he learned to do was use that in humorous ways. He liked to tell about a woman who came up to him and said, "Lincoln, you're the ugliest man I ever saw in my life." He said, "I can't help it." She said, "You could stay home."
Yeah, what kind of sense of humor did he have? Did he use his sense of humor to kind of cover up his dark side? Because I understand he was real moody.
Yes, well, he could switch from telling jokes to dropping into some long period of reverie. He would often people loved to be around him because often he would make witty remarks. He was listening to the British ambassador one evening make a speech, and the man ended his speech by saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." And Lincoln turned to Fred and said, "I think I know why. God can't trust him in the dark."
I'm amazed to read in your book also about his failures. I, of course, from schooling remember some of his failures, but didn't realize that he had failed so often in business that he had not been elected. He was defeated over and over again for different public offices that he ran for. He lost 2 children, one while he was in the White House, and just must have had a devastating effect on him, and yet he had an amazing tenacity to stick with it.
Yes, indeed. In fact, losing Willie when he was in the White House was just a devastating experience for him because he probably was closest to Willie, although he was close to Tad as well. And then the Civil War came along, and that meant the death of some of his closest friends. It was a terrible time for him. And if he had bouts of depression, they're understandable.
Yeah. Gene Greisman is a Lincoln scholar. He's written The Words Lincoln Lived By, and he has a website. It's PresidentLincoln.com. Believe it or not. I don't know how you got that, but PresidentLincoln.com. You must have gotten that nice and early so nobody else could get that, because I know they get out there and search some of those names.
I've had it for several years, and I'm really happy to have it. Incidentally, one of the quotes, you're kind enough to mention the book, The Words Lincoln Lived By. The first quote I use in the book, and you remember I mentioned I turned Lincoln into a motivational speaker.
Right.
He explained why he was successful. And here's the quote. "Always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing." Your own resolution to succeed.
And he lived that.
He really did. And during the days of the Civil War, he was just determined to succeed.
Right.
He believed willpower is like a muscle, and you can make it strong.
Dr. Greisman, tell me about other things that you do, because I know that you do a lot of motivational speaking, and you've interviewed so many famous people. You interviewed Ronald Reagan and Hank Aaron and Sandra Day O'Connor and Billy Joel. And what have you learned from those people?
Well, I learned that there are certain basic things that successful people do. And so I do a keynote for conventions called Lessons Learned from High Achievers. But I say to people, if you want to be successful in your career, study Lincoln, because Lincoln did the things that make people successful.
That's not something I think people would normally think of.
No. For example, I'll give you an example. I found out that when I interviewed very successful people, tell me very quickly what they're good at and what they are not good at. And Lincoln understood what he was good at and what he was not good at. And he played to his strengths and away from his weaknesses.
At what point in his life did you interview President Reagan?
Just before he was elected president. I believe he was associated with your town, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, with our radio station.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, what did you learn from your interview with him?
Well, first of all, I learned that he knew what his strengths were, and interestingly, one of his great strengths was his power to communicate with ordinary people. And Lincoln understood that. So in that respect, they were both great communicators. A second thing that I learned about Ronald Reagan was that he didn't take the first no when he got his part in the Knute Rockne story. He didn't expect to get that part, although he wanted it, and he did some very ingenious things to get it. Same thing with Lincoln. Lincoln positioned himself for a lucky break.
Do you find yourself thinking now as Lincoln would think? Do you filter everything through Lincoln, like, well, Lincoln would think this about this, or he'd say that?
Oh, it's a good question. A lot of my friends say that whenever I'm doing Lincoln, they don't know if it's Greisman doing Lincoln or Lincoln doing Greisman.
And finishing up here, Dr. Greisman, I'm really interested in Lincoln's faith, because he seems to mention God almost every time he gives a speech, or everything he wrote always had some mention of his faith in God. And yet I also have heard stories that he was involved in mysticism. Can you clarify that?
Well, first of all, Lincoln never joined the church. One reason he never joined the church was, in those days particularly, they were very narrow in their creedal interpretation, and he didn't want to get caught in those hair-splitting creeds and debates over that. However, he was a deeply spiritual man. His wife was more involved in spirituality
yeah.
and spiritualism
Okay.
than he was. But he was a deeply spiritual man.
Because some of his speeches, he quotes the Bible so often.
Well, he memorized big chunks of it.
Yes.
And the man did pray regularly.
And that really guided his entire life.
I think in many ways he became a holy man.
And in the recent survey that we saw of great presidents, he, of course, comes out on top. And I'm sure you're going to tell me that that's justified.
It's justified, first of all, the high ranking, because he does deserve it. He is a bona fide hero. The reason Americans put him at the very top, I think, is because they recognize he came from George Washington did equally impressive things, but George Washington was a patrician. He had a lot of advantages when he started. Lincoln had none.
Yeah. Dr. Gene Greisman, he's a Lincoln scholar. He portrays Lincoln throughout the United States. It's on Winsenberg on the weekend.